The moment my aunt said it, the entire room went quiet. She had a champagne flute in one hand and 30 years of resentment in the other, and she used both of them on me without blinking. "This," she announced to the table, to the investors, the lawyers, the firm partners who had flown in from 3 different cities for my cousin's engagement dinner, "is the one who dropped out. The family disappointment. Don't worry, she's just here to serve." She laughed after she said it. A short practice sound, like she'd been saving it. I was holding a water pitcher. My hand did not shake. I'd spent 2 years learning how to hold things steady when everything inside me wanted to give way. And that training held now even as I felt the familiar compression in my chest, the one I'd carried since I was 9 years old and first understood that in this family. I was the wrong kind of daughter. I did not bow my head. I did not retreat to the kitchen. I set the pitcher down on the linen tablecloth, and the sound it made was quiet but deliberate, and every person at that table heard it. "Are you sure you want to do this here?" I asked her. My aunt blinked. Nobody ever asked her that. I was 31 years old. I had a medical degree from Johns Hopkins and a board certification in emergency medicine and a position as an attending physician at one of the most respected trauma centers in Philadelphia. My aunt did not know any of this. My aunt thought I'd washed out of a community college nursing program 7 years ago and never recovered. She thought this because that was the story she had chosen to believe, and no one in my family had ever offered her a correction. Tonight, in the private dining room of the Whitmore Club in downtown Chicago, surrounded by her daughter's future in-laws and their assembled wealth, she was about to find out how wrong she had been. I grew up in the kind of house where achievement was a competition, and the rules changed depending on who was competing. My cousin Penny, my aunt's daughter, 5 years older than me, the one whose engagement party this was, had always been the standard by which everything else was measured. Penny got a car at 16. Penny got a study abroad semester in Florence. When Penny graduated from DePaul with a communications degree and a 2.8 GPA, my aunt threw a party that lasted 2 days. When I graduated from my high school as valedictorian the same spring, my grandmother mentioned it briefly at dinner, and my aunt changed the subject to Penny's new apartment. I don't say this with bitterness anymore. I've had enough years and enough therapy to understand the mechanics of it. My aunt, my mother's older sister, had always been the dominant figure in our extended family, and she had raised Penny to be her reflection. Everything that validated Penny validated my aunt. Everything that outshone Penny was a threat that needed managing. I was, apparently, a threat from very early on. My mother did her best. She was softer than her sister in every way. Temperament, spine, capacity for conflict, and she loved me fiercely and uselessly. When I was 12 and won the regional science fair, my mother framed the certificate and hung it in our kitchen. My aunt came over 2 weeks later and asked, within earshot of me, whether my mother was worried that encouraging me so much would make me arrogant, whether I really had the social skills to back up the grades, whether I understood that intelligence without emotional maturity was a liability. I stood in the hallway outside the kitchen listening to this conversation, and I learned something important. The problem was never my performance. The problem was that my performance made Penny look ordinary by comparison, and my aunt was never going to forgive me for that. I stopped telling her things after that. I stopped letting her know about awards and acceptances and recognitions. When I applied to colleges and got into Northwestern, I told my mother, and no one else. When Northwestern gave me a merit scholarship that covered most of my tuition, I told my mother in a whisper, like we were sharing a secret that needed protecting. She cried a little. We had dinner at the diner on Route 14, just the two of us, and she held my hand across the table and said she was proud of me. And I believed her, and it was enough. The summer before my junior year, I switched my major from biology to pre-med and told no one except my academic advisor. Not because I was ashamed, but because I had learned that my accomplishments, when shared with certain people, became weapons they could use against me. I kept them close until they were real enough to be undeniable. The conversation that changed everything happened the week before I was supposed to take the MCAT. Penny had announced her acceptance into a master's program at Loyola, and my aunt had organized a celebratory dinner at her house. I went because my mother asked me to, and because I was still young enough to believe that refusing would cost more than attending. At some point during dessert, my aunt mentioned that I should think about a more realistic path forward. She had heard, she said, that medical school was extremely competitive. She had heard that the acceptance rates were very low. She had heard implicitly that someone like me should not waste everyone's time with ambitions that exceeded her station. She never said any of this directly. She was too practiced for that. It came out in questions. Have you thought about what happens if it doesn't work out? Do you have a backup plan? Penny's program has a very good track record for job placement if you're interested in something with more security. I sat at that table and I smiled and I said I appreciated the concern. And when I got home, I sat in my car in front of my apartment building for 40 minutes. I had 98th percentile MCAT scores. I had research publications with my name on them. I had a letter of recommendation from a department chair at Northwestern who said I was one of the most focused students he had encountered in 15 years of teaching. None of this existed in the world my aunt had constructed for me, because I had kept it all private, and in the absence of information, she had filled the space with her own preferred version of events. That night, I made a decision. I was going to stop correcting her, not because I agreed with her, but because I understood that correcting her verbally, telling her my grades, my scores, my letters, would accomplish nothing. She would minimize it, rationalize it, redirect the conversation to Penny's achievements. The only correction that would mean anything was the one she couldn't talk around. I applied to medical school the following fall. I got into Johns Hopkins. I told my mother in our same diner, at our same table, and she pressed her hand over her mouth and her eyes got bright. And we sat there together for a long time, not saying anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. I did not tell my aunt. Not then. Not through 4 years of medical school. Not through residency. Not when I published 2 more research papers, or when I matched at a top emergency medicine program, or when I took the attending position in Philadelphia, and for the first time in my adult life had a salary that felt like it belonged to the life I had actually built. She called me a dropout because when I was 23, I had taken a leave of absence from my nursing prerequisite courses to focus on MCAT prep, and she had interpreted that leave without asking as permanent failure. I never corrected the record because by the time she'd made up her mind about it, the truth was already somewhere she couldn't reach. The Whitmore Club occupied the 14th and 15th floors of a building on Michigan Avenue with views of the lake that cost money just to look at. The private dining room where Penny's engagement dinner was being held had 12 seats around a mahogany table, a sommelier, and 2 servers. My mother had asked me to come because Penny had asked me to come, and because there were 7 years between us now that had softened into something almost civil, and because my mother said it would mean a lot. I arrived straight from a flight from Philadelphia. I'd been on call the night before and had worked a 16-hour shift before catching a 6 a.m. connection through Detroit. I was tired in the way that lives in your bones rather than your eyes. The kind of tired that emergency medicine teaches you to work around because it doesn't wait for convenient hours. The engagement dinner had already started when I got there. Penny was at the head of the table next to her fiancé, a man named Theodore who worked in private equity and had the kind of handshake that announced itself. His parents were there, Howard and Suzanne, who had built a real estate portfolio across the Midwest that apparently qualified them for this room. Howard's business partner had come with his wife. A family attorney was present, and my aunt sat near the center, orchestrating, wearing the expression she wore when she felt that everything was going according to her design. There was a seat for me near the end of the table. Not quite banished, but positioned. I understood immediately. One of the club servers had a family emergency just before the dinner, and the maître d' asked quietly whether I would mind helping with the water service for the first part of the evening, given the short staff situation. I said of course, because that's what you say, because I had grown up being helpful and I still defaulted to it before I could think. My aunt watched me pick up the water pitcher with an expression that told me she had filed this information away for later use. The dinner conversation moved through the usual currents: Penny's plans, Theodore's sperm, the upcoming wedding venue search, Howard and Suzanne's most recent trip to Scottsdale. I moved around the table. I was good at being invisible. Medical training makes you good at that. Actually, you learn to modulate your presence based on what the situation requires, to step back when stepping back serves the patient better than stepping forward. I reached my aunt's end of the table. I reached for the glass beside Theodore's father. My aunt chose that moment. She had been building to it, I think. For most of the dinner, she had been watching me move around the table with my pitcher, and she had been constructing her moment the way she always constructed moments, with the careful architecture of someone who knows exactly what she's doing. This, she said, raising her voice just enough, is the one who dropped out. The family disappointment. Don't worry, she's just here to serve. The laughter that followed was hers alone. Howard and Suzanne exchanged a glance. Theodore looked at the table. Penny, to her credit, looked genuinely uncomfortable. The attorney examined his bright plate with sudden interest. I set the pitcher down. Are you sure you want to do this here? I asked. She wasn't prepared for that. She recovered with the speed of long practice. But there was a flicker, a half-second where I saw her recalibrate. I'm just being honest, sweetheart, she said. These are important people. We don't need to pretend. No, I agreed. We don't. I looked at Howard, who was watching me now with the careful attention of a man who has spent his career reading rooms. I looked at Suzanne, who had the practiced social grace to look neither amused nor appalled. I looked at Theodore's family attorney, a woman named, well, it didn't matter. She was watching me with the particular alertness of someone who had learned to notice when a conversation was about to change direction. I appreciate the concern about pretending, I said to my aunt, so let me not pretend. What I said next, I said quietly. I wasn't performing for the table. I wasn't proving anything to anyone except myself, and I had been waiting 7 years for the moment to feel right, and it felt right now. I told them I was an attending physician in the emergency department at Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia. I told them I had done my medical degree at Johns Hopkins and my residency at Penn. I said it the way I might say it at a conference, without apology or flourish, because those were simply the facts. My aunt's expression did something I had never seen it do before. It didn't collapse, exactly. It didn't crumble. It simply went still, the way a face goes still when the story it has been telling itself runs out of road. That's not, she started. I haven't corrected you before because it didn't seem to matter, I said. You had already made your decision about me and I didn't have any particular interest in changing your mind, but you're saying it in front of people who might actually believe you, so? Theodore's father leaned forward slightly. Jefferson Hospital? The trauma center? Yes, my brother-in-law was there last fall. Motorcycle accident. The team in the ED. He paused. That's a serious program. It is, I said. Suzanne was looking at my aunt now with an expression that was carefully neutral, but carried something underneath it, the way still water carries things you can't see from the surface. My aunt found her voice again. You never said anything. Your mother never. My mother knew. We chose not to make a production of it. I picked up the water pitcher again because I had a job to complete and I had been raised to finish what I started. I apologize for the interruption. The salmon is excellent, by the way. The chef here is very good. I continued around the table. The dinner broke apart the way things break apart when the evening's real event has already happened and everyone is waiting for permission to acknowledge it. Theodore found me near the window during the after-dinner drinks. He was shorter than he seemed at the table and more uncertain, and he had the look of someone who was reworking several assumptions in real time. Hopkins, he said. Hopkins, I confirmed. I went to Wharton, he offered, as though we were exchanging credentials, which I suppose we were. I know. Penny mentioned it. I looked out at the lake, which was dark and enormous and indifferent. She's very happy for what it's worth. She talks about you differently than she's talked about other people. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't know about your career. Most people didn't. Why? I thought about how to answer that honestly. Because the people in this family who knew about my ambitions spent a lot of energy trying to talk me out of them. After a while, it was easier to just do the thing, and then the doing became private habit. He nodded slowly, working through something. She does that, he said finally, without specifying who he meant. He didn't need to. I know, I said. Howard appeared beside his son with 2 glasses of bourbon and the easy physicality of a man who has never had to work hard at taking up space. He handed one to Theodore and looked at me for a moment. Jefferson's ED director, he said. Harrigan. Do you know him? He was my program director during residency. Howard nodded, something settling in his expression. He was the kind of man I could see who organized the world by professional hierarchy, and I had just been slotted into a category that made sense to him. Good man. Runs a tight ship. He paused. Your aunt has been describing you as, I know what she's been describing. He took a drink. Families, he said, in the tone of a man who has navigated enough of them to have arrived at a kind of exhausted philosophy. Families, I agreed. My aunt found me near the coat check at the end of the evening. The guests had thinned out, Theodore's family had said their careful and recalibrated goodbyes, and the room felt like a place after a storm. Rearranged, not quite settled. She looked different, up close. I had been watching her from the other end of the table all night as a strategic problem, a source of damage to be contained, and now she was just a woman in her early 60s who had spent most of her adult life organizing herself around the wrong things. "You should have told me," she said. "You wouldn't have heard me." She started to object, and then she stopped, because somewhere underneath the practiced defenses, she was honest enough to know that I was right. "I was trying to protect Penny," she said finally. "I know." This was the thing I had understood for years that she had never said out loud. I was never competing with Penny. I was just trying to become something. Those aren't the same thing. She was quiet for a long moment. The coat check attendant pretended not to exist. "Your mother must be very proud," she said at last. "She is." I took my coat. "She has been for a long time." I walked out through the lobby of the Whitmore Club and into the October night, which was cold off the lake and tasted like something ending. I stood on Michigan Avenue for a moment before calling a car, and I felt the particular exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. Not because she apologized, not because she understood, but because I had said the true thing in the room where it needed to be said, and I couldn't be made small by her again, now that the people she'd been performing for had seen what she'd been performing around. My mother called me the next morning. I was in my hotel room eating room service eggs and watching the lake through a window that cost money just to look out of, and her name on my phone screen made me smile before I answered. "Howard called Penny this morning," she said. "He wanted to know if you were accepting new patients. I'm an ER doctor, Mom. It doesn't work like that." I know. But he asked, and apparently his wife looked you up last night and found your hospital profile and your publications and showed them to her husband and—" She paused. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying." She was quiet for a moment. I could hear her kitchen in the background, the coffee maker, the particular sound of her house on a Saturday morning. "I wish you told her sooner," she said. "I know. Not for her sake. For yours." Another pause. "You carried it so long, sweetheart." I thought about that. The years of keeping things quiet and private and protected. The satisfaction of it, which had been real, and the cost of it, which had also been real. The way secrecy can feel like armor until you realize that armor is also weight. "I'm okay," I told her. "I know you are." I could hear her smiling. "I've known that for a long time." Penny called me 3 days after I got back to Philadelphia. We had not been close for most of our adult lives. The gap between us had always been managed by our mother's complicated relationship, and navigating it had required more energy than either of us wanted to spend. But she called, and I answered, and she was quiet for a moment before she said, "I'm sorry about my mother." "You don't have to apologize for her." "I know. I'm doing it anyway." Another pause. "Theodore's father wants to offer you a position on the board of his foundation, the medical one." I told him I'd pass it along. I looked at the window of my apartment, at the Philadelphia skyline getting dark. "Tell him I appreciate it, and I'll think about it." "Okay." Then, "She's not going to change, you know. She's going to process this and file it away and find a way to make it a story where she's still right." "I know." "Then why did you say anything? You could have just stayed quiet, like you always did." I thought about this for a long time, long enough that Penny made a small questioning sound to check if I was still there. "Because I was tired," I said finally. Not of her, just of the silence. It had gotten heavy enough that carrying it was costing me something, and I decided I wasn't going to pay that price anymore. I paused. That's all it was, really. I wasn't trying to win anything. I was just done pretending I hadn't. I see patients in the emergency department 4 days a week. I see people on the worst days of their lives, the days when the body has failed in some urgent and terrifying way, when the machinery has broken down without warning and fear is the only thing in the room. I have learned to be steady in those moments. I have learned that steadiness is not the absence of feeling, but the ability to continue functioning alongside feeling, which is different. The night of Penny's engagement dinner was not the worst day of my life. It wasn't even particularly close. But it was the day I stopped being invisible to the people who had decided, long ago, that invisibility suited me. I grew up in a family that assigned me a role and then spent years being surprised when I didn't fill it. I worked 3 jobs to get through medical school without asking for a cent from anyone who might have used the money to tell me who to be. I graduated and trained and built a career in the rooms where things are hardest, and I kept quiet about it because quiet had felt like protection. It wasn't protection, it was just distance. I think about my aunt sometimes and I don't hate her. I understand the mechanics well enough not to meet hate. She built her identity around her daughter's success, and my success threatened that architecture, and she defended herself the only way she knew how, by deciding that I had failed. It's not a good way to live, but it's a common one. What I know now, standing on the other side of that dinner, is this. The people who diminish you do it from their own limitations, not from any accurate reading of yours. They need you to be smaller because your actual size is inconvenient for the story they've decided to tell. Build yourself anyway. Do the work anyway. Take the tests. Finish the program. Show up to the shift. Write the paper. Do it quietly if you have to. Do it in secret if you have to. But don't let someone else's version of you become the one you live inside. And when the moment comes, not the moment of revenge, but the moment of truth, don't set it aside because it's uncomfortable or complicated or poorly timed. The truth doesn't need dramatic staging. It just needs someone willing to say it out loud in the room where it matters. I set a water pitcher down on a white tablecloth in a private dining room on Michigan Avenue, and everything I had built in silence became visible at last. That is all it was. That is everything it was. I've thought about that dinner a lot since it happened. Not obsessively. I don't have the bandwidth for obsession, not with the shifts I work. But in the quiet moments, the ones between patients when the department is briefly, deceptively still, I think about my aunt's face when the story she had been telling for 7 years ran out of ground to stand on. And I think about what it cost me to let her tell it for so long. Here's what I understand now that I didn't understand at 23. Silence isn't neutral. I thought I was being strategic. I thought keeping my life private, building in secret, protecting my ambitions from people who had already decided they'd fail. I thought that was smart. And in some ways it was. It got me through. But it also meant that for 7 years, my aunt's version of me was the one that circulated at family dinners and holiday gatherings. And now, apparently, engagement parties where people actually mattered. I let a false story exist because correcting it felt like more trouble than it was worth. What I didn't account for was the weight of it. Not the unfairness. I could live with unfairness. But the slow, accumulating cost of holding your real self at a distance from the people who were supposed to know you. That weight doesn't announce itself. It just gets heavier, quietly, until one evening in a private dining room on Michigan Avenue, you find yourself setting down a water pitcher and deciding you're done. The thing about my aunt is that she didn't set out to be cruel. I want to be honest about that because it's easy to flatten people into their worst moments and call that understanding. She set out to protect something she valued, which was her daughter's sense of herself, and she did it by diminishing mine. That's a choice with consequences. The consequences caught up with her at Penny's engagement dinner in front of Howard and Suzanne and a room full of people whose opinions she had spent months carefully cultivating. That's how it works, I think. Not as punishment, not as some cosmic balancing act, but as simple cause and effect. When you build your identity on keeping someone else small, you become dependent on their smallness. And if they refuse to stay small, the whole architecture shifts. My aunt's discomfort that night was the direct result of the choices she had made over 20 years, playing out in real time in front of exactly the audience she had most wanted to impress. She handed me that moment herself. I just didn't look away from it. What I want to say, to anyone who has spent years doing the work quietly while someone else circulated a lesser version of you, the work is what matters, not the reveal, not the moment of vindication. Those are real, but they pass. What stays is the thing you built while no one was watching. Penny's future father-in-law called my hospital the next morning because of a medical degree that existed long before that dinner. The dinner didn't create anything. It only made visible what was already there. Integrity isn't a performance. It's what you do with the years when nobody's paying attention. Theodore's father said my residency director runs a tight ship. He does. I learned more in that program than I could have absorbed in any easier circumstance. I learned that showing up matters more than feeling ready. I learned that the hard days are the ones that actually teach you something. I learned that the people who doubt you out loud are often doing you an accidental favor. They make the alternative to succeeding feel so intolerable that you stop treating failure as an option. Build anyway, learn anyway, show up to the shift, finish the program, do the hard thing in the hard room. Not for the dinner where it finally gets acknowledged. For the person you become in the years before anyone's watching.